Welcome to Business Innovators Radio, featuring industry influencers and trendsetters sharing proven strategies to help you build a better life right now.
Welcome to this episode of Business Innovators Radio. This is guest host Donna Gunter. Today we have with us Annalee Kruger. Annalee has devoted her entire career to seniors and their families. Her long-term care career spans more than 28 years and includes work as a social worker and executive director in continuing care retirement communities. As a result, she fully understands the impact of medical crises on family relationships, compassion fatigue, and the value of proactive planning. As president of CareRight Incorporated, she and her team provide concierge, aging planning, consulting, and coaching services to families with aging loved ones across the nation by leveraging technology. CareRight develops, implements, and oversees a customized plan while offering support and guidance to the entire family unit. CareRight recently launched the Care Crusade, a nationwide campaign to improve healthcare outcomes for all. Annalee is also an Amazon best-selling author of the book, The Invisible Patient, the emotional, financial, and physical toll on family caregivers. Welcome to the show, Annalee.
Hi, thanks, Donna. Thanks for having me.
Well, I am so happy to have you here today because I think what you do is so important. When I do shows like this, the first thing I like to ask my guests are, how did you come to be in this profession? What life events led you to becoming a senior care advocate?
It started young. I knew when I was 9 years old in third grade, that I was going to be I didn't know what a social worker was back then, but all I knew was that I developed a passion for seniors and families working together as a team to help provide the best quality care possible for their parents, whether the kids decide they want to be that full-time caregiver or we need to align, a professional care team. My grandparents lived with us when we were growing up, and that was such a great experience. What I learned from that is, like, my grandmother did not age well. She had a lot of pain and osteoporosis. She was very medically complex, so she had a very different aging journey than my grandfather, who really just needed socialization. And so being a caregiver from that young age, we all pitched in to make sure that Grandma and Grandpa had the care that they needed. And the reason it worked is because we communicated properly as a family and effectively as a family, but we also didn't shy away from difficult conversations like, what are we going to do if we can't take care of her or we can't take care of him? And so our family just always communicated openly, and that's what I want for other families too, because we had a positive aging and caregiving experience, but it's because we had enough supports in place and we communicated effectively.
Well, that's pretty amazing that you knew your calling at age 9. I don't think many people have that kind of indication in their life at that age. Well, I know you didn't. You didn't just sprout at age 9 and suddenly become a senior care advocate with your own business. You must have had a journey in between age 9 and becoming president of your own company. Talk a little bit about that journey and how you got from that realization at age 9 to your own company.
So my mom was a Girl Scout leader, and for any of you who are in Girl Scouts and you have a mother who's a Girl Scout leader, you will end up in Girl Scouts, whether you want to or not. And so she also, a lot of her listeners are probably like, yeah, that's me too. And so anyway, she would volunteer us kids to do different things when we were growing up. And even though we grumbled at it, it really helped shape us into good, integrity-filled character, compassionate people. And so she would volunteer me to be a candy striper. Back then it was just volunteers who would go and offer snacks and spend time with elderly people in the nursing homes. And then in college, because by then I knew, this is what social workers do. We help advocate for those who need a voice and help families understand what their situation is and help understand aging and dementia and what our care options are. So I went and got my social work degree and also at the same time lived with a 68-year-old woman who needed basically just some companionship and help with getting bathed and dressed and making sure that she had her meds, taking medications and stuff. So that's what I did while I was in college getting my social work degree. And then when I graduated, 2 weeks after I graduated from college, I started my first position as an employee in long-term care and care retirement communities like CCRCs. Stayed in those types of social work and marketing positions until I started my own company, Care Right, in 2011. The reason I started my own company is because part of my job, and this is, 30 years ago when I first started in long-term care, they had one person do multiple jobs. It's different now because now they have a separate marketing person, they have a separate discharge planner, they have a separate social worker. Now it's much, much easier in some ways, but back then it wasn't set up that way. So I learned everything there is to know about long-term care, aging and dementia and family dynamics because I filled all of these roles. And I can tell you that, families would come in blindsided because they were in the midst of a crisis. Mom fell, she broke her hip. She's in the hospital. She's the primary caregiver to dad who has dementia. Kids come home and realize how demented dad is, and now what are we going to do with mom, and what are we going to do with dad? And so the tours would only take about an hour, but I was spending 2 and 3 hours at a time with each family because they had so many questions, and they just really didn't know what their options were. And they also didn't understand, they didn't know because their families never had family meetings. So when I would ask simple questions like, is there a living will in place? Is there power of attorney? Are funeral arrangements taken care of? Do your parents have long-term care insurance? Is your dad a veteran or your mom a veteran? And are they receiving like aid and attendance benefits? And the answers were always like, I don't know, Annalee. Our family never talks about stuff like that. So in 2011, I decided to leave corporate America because my boss kept writing me up for spending too much time with people who weren't clients yet. She's like, you can't be spending that much time with these families, but what she wasn't connecting the dots with is, well, they're coming to the care communities that I'm representing because I spent the time and helped them sort out their options. But I got tired of getting written up, and I knew at some point she would just fire me for spending too much time with families. So I'm like, well, honestly, the only way I can really make an impact in the way that I want to make an impact is to start my own company, and I did. So I started Care Right in 2010, and within the first month of basically hanging my shingle, so to speak, I had families literally lined up help. They're like, we need your help. We don't know what our care options are for mom and dad, but we know that we're getting burned out, and we know that we don't want our family relationships to continue to suffer because they don't want to be resentful of each other and resentful of their parents because they were full-time caregivers. That's kind of my journey. Right. I went virtual in 2012 because honestly, 30 years ago when I first started, families lived down the street from each other. So I could go to Ethel and Marvin's house and their kids could easily gather around the kitchen table and we could sort things through, like what's working well at home, what's not working well here, who's doing what, like what is everybody's role, who's making sure that medications are being administered and who's doing care coordination, who's helping with bill pay, who's helping with bathing and showers and dressing and doctor's appointments and socialization. And so, and what do we already have in place? Do you have your living will in place, your estate documents? Do you have long-term care insurance? Do you have all of your documents and your accounts and your passwords? We didn't have passwords back then because the internet was just coming out. But do you have all this stuff in order? And I could do that because families lived down the street from each other, so we could gather around that kitchen table. But in 2012, a year after I started Care Right, families just don't live near each other. They've moved away. And so the only way to facilitate their family meetings and help them understand what their care options are and what their family's options are was to leverage technology. So I used to use Skype, but the last, 5-6 years, I've been using Zoom. That's how I went nationwide. I have families across the country because they don't live near each other, and they were worried about their parents because they're like, we can't provide the support and the care that mom and dad need because we live a flight away, and they can't keep affording to jump on those emergency air flights that are $1,600 one way when you need to be at the hospital, the next day when you get that crisis call.
Well, Annalee, I know something else that makes you unique is that you've been on the other side of the fence, so to speak, in the caring community, in that you had a pretty severe accident in your younger years.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that and how that led to also forming probably some of the way you do things in your business today?
I've always been, pretty much everything that comes out of my mouth is about proactive planning for yourselves, whether you're 30 years old or you're 50 years old or you're 80 years old. And so what happened, 4 days after my 40th birthday, I had just come back from, I'm an international speaker on aging issues and dementia, because other countries are having they're in the same predicament that we are. They don't have enough workers for the volume of seniors that are coming down the pike in the silver tsunami. And so I had just come back from China and made it through the third world country mostly unscathed. And then was in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, seeing clients, and I encountered this elderly gentleman. He was like 82 years old, and he was moving pretty slowly up the street. And I'm from Iowa. We're pretty friendly people there. And so I was in Sheboygan, and I said hi to him. And I knew that, when you say hello and how are you to someone who's seasoned, that you're probably going to get kind of a list of what their health issues are. And sure enough, he was sharing what his health issues were. So I said, well, let me walk across the street with you to help you get where you want to go, and then I'll just carry on with my way of where I was going to go. We were crossing the street. He was still telling me about his health issues, and so I was looking at him because he was talking to me. And when we started across the street, obviously it was clear. We were fine to cross across the crosswalk. Unfortunately, a bus went through the stop sign, the four-corner stop, and she didn't see me until my face broke the headlight of the school bus. And so I flew,
wow,
according to witnesses, because this was, of course, over the lunch hour, so there were tons of witnesses everywhere, which was good for me, I guess. But anyway, so they're like, oh, my gosh. So I got up off the street, and I'm like, what the heck? What just happened here? People just came out of these businesses, because it was the main street in Sheboygan, and they're like, oh, my gosh, you just flew 15 feet. I can't believe you got up. And I'm, like, still trying to put all this pieces together, like what just happened here? So then I see all this like broken reflectors and broken glass on the street. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I think I just got hit by a school bus. And by then all these people are like running out and they're like, oh my God, you just got hit by a school bus. And I'm like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense now. And so I was so afraid, because I work in crisis management. And so I know that and I've always worked in long-term care. So I know that those folks that moved into the nursing home, they were okay one day and then they weren't. Like they fell and then they broke their hip, or their dementia progressed, and now it progressed so much that they couldn't stay at home. So I've always fully appreciated that your life can truly change in one heartbeat, one fall, one stroke, one heart attack. And so I know this. And so all these witnesses were standing around, and so I'm like doing my own little memory test. I'm moving my extremities to make sure that like my fingers move and my feet move. And I'm like, okay, this is all so far so good. And so I gave each of these witnesses a small snippet of something to remember. So like, my name is Annalee Kruger, and I gave someone else my birth date. I gave someone else I'm allergic to penicillin and sulfa, so I gave them that. And I carry, because I do crisis management, and I've always been just very aware that your life can change within a second. So I carry my living will and my healthcare power of attorney, and I carry my DNR, my do not resuscitate. And so I had those in my purse. And so I gave my paperwork to another witness. And that way, in case I lost consciousness, by the time the paramedics came, they would be able to at least advocate for me and say, well, this is who she is, and these are what her wishes are. So when the paramedics came, Marie was one of the paramedics drivers, and she's like, oh my gosh, I've never had someone in the back of the ambulance that's so prepared as what you are. And I'm like, well, that's because I do crisis management. But unfortunately, I had a broken face, because obviously my face broke the headlight of the school bus. And so fortunately, I'm 5'10", and I'm a strong Iowa farm girl. So if I would have been a petite little thing, it would have probably had a very different outcome. But my point in all of this is, and I share this with families, is I didn't wake up that morning on May 3rd of 2011 and be like, or 2012 and be like, I think I'm going to have my life devastated. I mean, I have my grab and go binder, all of my documents in order, and what's just as important, what's even more important is, for your listeners, is it's so important to have what I created as a grab and go binder, and it's got 11 tabs in it, and behind each tab are suggested checklisted items that you should include. So like behind the insurance tab, all things insurance, like your boat insurance, your motorcycle insurance, your disability insurance, your life insurance, all things insurance, because if I would have lost consciousness, I mean, my family is prepared because they not only have a copy of my grab and go binder and all of my documents, but I've actually also had frequent family meetings about, in case anything happens to me, here's my accounts, here's my passwords, here's what I have for insurance, here's my advance directives. They have copies of everything, and they know that if they ever get that phone call that something's happened to me, they know exactly what to do and where everything is at. And it's important that every single person has their affairs in order, not only for medical crises or if you get hit by a car or anything like that, but how many people went in for what they thought was going to be a simple hip surgery, and then they had a stroke or a heart attack on the surgical table. And so what they went in for something what they thought was simple didn't end up that way at all. And then now the family's in crisis and they have no idea what their loved one has in place. So again, I don't care if you're 30, 50, or 90, everyone needs to have their affairs in order.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with the paramedic that I don't think anyone she would probably ever encounter again that would be as prepared as you were or as cognizant as you were at the time to be able to hand out these pieces of information to various bystanders and witnesses. And so, you were in crisis at that point and pulled through in a remarkable fashion, to have the presence of mind to do that. But I know that that's a very unique and unusual event that I would assume the majority of your families aren't in that situation. They're coming to you, I'm assuming, when there's some type of crisis in the family or medical crisis. Talk a little bit about that and how you help them through that crisis to get them to the next point.
So, when I built Care Right in 2011, I clearly had some grandiose thinking, because I'm just like, I'm gonna help all these families across the country, and we're gonna do proactive aging planning. So, like, all of my marketing materials, the website, I do tons of speaking engagements, always have, tons of podcasts, tons of these radio interviews. I mean, all I do is talk about the value of being having a proactive family meetings about the what ifs of when dad's dementia progresses, what are we going to do? Who's going to take care of him? How are we going to pay for that care? Where is he going to live? How are we going to cope with that as a family? So despite my best efforts at trying to get consumers to do proactive planning, you're right. The reality is 92% of my clients come to me in a crisis, and things are a mess because they've waited so long to realize that, we are in crisis now. And so things are a mess. And when I say a mess, I mean, because the families are burned out as caregivers, they're overwhelmed. Some of them have quit their jobs, or they've not taken the job promotions that they wanted because they knew that they couldn't manage, that much more of a career plus family life and taking care of parents. So their relationships are a mess. Some of the daughters and sons are so just emotionally worn out and physically worn out, and pretty much sometimes financially worn out too, because they're trying to do the right thing for their parents, but it's coming at a significant emotional, physical, and financial cost and relationship cost to the family. So a lot of them have nothing in order. They may not have their living wills in order. They don't have their powers of attorney in order, so I refer them to attorneys. They may not know anything about long-term care insurance, or if their parent even has long-term care insurance or VA benefits. So they need to really do a lot of searching around the house to even find clues of mail, what do parents have. So a lot of families come to me with they're really hurting, and things are a mess. Their parents are medically complex. Their dementia has progressed to the point where now the kids finally realize, they're not safe to live at home because they're not taking their medications, they're not eating, they're wandering out of the home and the neighbors are constantly calling you that, oh, your mom got out again. We brought her back in, but what's the plan next time? Families come to me in pretty much mostly a mess. Some of them are obviously more prepared than others. So that's why I offer that complimentary 30-minute phone consult or Zoom consult to see, okay, what do you actually have in place and where are kind of the gaps in your planning? The goal is that the value proposition is that obviously we put an aging plan in place for mom and dad, but you as the adult children are learning how expensive care is, and no, Medicare does not pay for all of this, all of the care. So a lot of what I have to do, what takes so much time, is just educating families on the reality of their situation and what care options that they have based on what their parents can afford. But also that next generation of adult kids going, oh my gosh, I am not leaving my family in this type of a pickle. So they also then do the grab and go binder, and they start having conversations with their kids about the what ifs if something should happen to them.
Well, Annalee, I know that COVID has had a massive impact on society as a whole all over the world, and I'm sure it's impacted what's going on in the caregiving community too, in terms of options available, space availability, et cetera. Talk a little bit about how COVID has impacted your role as a senior care advocate and how you've worked through those issues since the pandemic started last year.
So the pandemic, I actually wrote my thesis on the changing landscape of long-term care and health care because families are so much smaller than they used to be. 8 and 10, 12 kids were born, right? But now families are just smaller and smaller, so that automatically reduces the family caregiver potential pool, because we know that families provide about 80% of the care that's provided to seniors. So when families being smaller, that also automatically reduces our employment pool for professional caregivers. So what happened with the pandemic is people were obviously getting sick and couldn't come to work. And so seniors at home were struggling because the home care workers, there was a shortage of them. There still is a massive shortage of professional healthcare workers. Facilities or care communities weren't taking on any new admissions because they didn't have staff to take care of the people they already had, right? And so families weren't deemed essential either, and neither were patient advocates, and neither was the state ombudsman, who are advocates also for folks in senior care homes. So everybody was shut out. Everyone that could have helped these seniors was shut out. And so we saw care totally plummet, the quality of care and the quality of attention to your loved ones totally plummeted. And that's still an ongoing issue. I don't see that changing. Healthcare workers are walking off their shifts. The good ones are getting really burned out. And so, healthcare is a mess. And so aging planning has always been critical. Like you don't have the luxury of time to just wait. You can't dilly-dally when you have an aging loved one and their condition is going to change, because you know that it will. You have to have a plan ahead of time, because home care workers are short. They don't have quality staff to fill the shifts that your loved one might need or that you might need for your loved one. Facilities are still working short-staffed, and the other challenge is that a lot of key leadership positions in these hospital systems and these long-term care systems, they've quit or they've retired early because they want to leave their career on a high note and not leaving their career on a low note, being a poor performer facility, because they just can't provide the quality of care that these seniors deserve. So it's definitely impacted what your options are for care. Some states are not taking out-of-state admissions. So if you live in a different state than your parents and something happens to them, where are they going to go? And where do they financially qualify to go? That's one way it's definitely been impacted. And as far as the massive turnover in leadership, I experienced this with my own mother, who unfortunately needed to move into memory care just shortly before the pandemic. And because families were no longer allowed to be in and advocate for their families, and short-staffedness and just truly untrained people taking care of our most senior, vulnerable adult population. It was mortifying. And you can only advocate so much through a window. So that's one other thing that has impacted, if the world shuts down again or senior care shuts down again, we also talk to families about, okay, what's the plan? Because are you only wanting like a first floor room? Fortunately, because Mom was on a first floor room, we could still see her, but it's still not the same. And so when there's such turnover in executive directors or memory care directors or nurse managers, then these 11 and 12 and $13 an hour employees are really the ones that are running the place, and they're not supervised, they're not properly managed. There's no leadership to say, look, that's not how you toilet someone, or that's not how you transfer someone and put them into bed. So they were actually, my mom was falling every 2 weeks. I'd get a call every 2 weeks like clockwork. And it was second and third shift, and I just cringed whenever the phone rang because I knew that something bad had happened to my mom. They weren't trained in dementia care, and she was in a memory care facility, and they were removing her walker from her. So they'd put her in her chair, or she'd go into the bed, and then they would move her walker and put it into the bathroom. So obviously she was falling. It wasn't until the third executive director who finally allowed me to put a camera in her room, and that's how I knew what was happening with her and why she was falling, because they were removing the walker. So what's
Wow.
transpired is and she ended up with 7 open areas, and this is supposed to be a memory care facility who's trained in memory care, right? And so but they had the year and a half that she lived there, they had 4 executive directors, they had 3 wellness nurses, they had 3 different memory care directors, so there was no leadership. To scare the listeners, but this is the reality of what's happening. And if there's no leadership and no supervision, do you really honestly think that your loved one is going to get quality care? Let that sink in. Like, who is advocating for your loved one to make sure that they're actually safe and that they're not going to be prematurely basically killed? And that's what happened with my own mother. They served her the wrong diet, and she choked on a chicken bone, and she choked to death in June of this year. So
wow.
Not only has it hit me personally, just the quality of care or the lack of quality of care, but we see things like this happening every single day with our patient advocacy division, with residents being hospitalized for no reason. They're being hospitalized because they weren't properly taken care of. Like, their compression hose weren't put on, so now their congestive heart failure has worsened, and now they're in the hospital because the nurse didn't put the compression hose on. So I actually created 30 different courses for families to learn how to advocate boldly for your loved one and what you actually need to be checking on. And if you don't live locally to your loved one and they're in a care home or they're still at home with home care, use cameras, and you need to call and check and make sure that they're being properly taken care of. So I've created classes and checklists for families because I would love to be able to have the capacity to help the 65.7 million family caregivers that are out there in the United States. But unfortunately, I'm just kind of one person. So I've created these classes so that if you have concerns about how is your loved one going to be treated and taken care of, are they going to be triple diapered, or are they actually going to be toileted? Are they going to be spending the whole day in the hospital bed in the nursing home because staff aren't taking them out, getting them up and out of their bed? So if your loved one lives in a facility or is still at home, I encourage families you have to be actively involved. You can't just assume because you're paying assisted living facility $8,000 that your loved one is actually being showered or bathed or toileted or shaved. So you can't just assume that they're going to be taken care of properly just because you're cutting a check every month. You have to be a bold advocate, because all of our clients, they were being neglected in these facilities or by these home care workers until the families found us and retained us on how to advocate for the family member that they can't do on their own. So it's so critical to have an aging plan and really understand what's happening with our seniors and vulnerable adults in senior care and hospitals and home care. It's just, we're in a crisis right now, and families you have to know that, and you have to have a plan so that your loved one gets the best quality of care.
Well, Annalee, I know you said earlier that, you're one person among I forgot what the number you quoted, 65 million, 6.5 million, whatever it was, of families that need your services out there. One way that I know that you can touch these folks is through the new book that you wrote, The Invisible Patient. Talk a little bit about what you covered in that book and how people can get a copy of that if they think that they have a family member that's in crisis, or their own family is headed in a crisis direction.
So I wrote the book, The Invisible Patient, the emotional, financial, and physical toll on family caregiving, because as a family care planner for basically 30 years, 28 years, I can't tell you how many, literally thousands of families have said, oh my gosh, I just wish I had a manual for what to do with mom and dad. And so, because as you can imagine, it's the adult son and daughter who hire me or who reach out to me because they're burned out. And even though moms and dads always say, well, I want to stay at home, but I don't want to be a burden on my kids, guess who it is that's reaching out to me for an aging plan? It's the adult kids, because they're burned out. They are feeling burdened by their aging parents. And so I wrote this book, The Invisible Patient, because almost all families, when they come to me, they're burned out, they feel alone, they're isolated because they feel like they've either had to change jobs, or their relationships with their siblings is now so strained that they don't get along anymore. They are so exhausted from caregiving and just worrying about how their parents are doing, that their marriages and relationships and friendships are failing. That's why on the book, you'll see, if you go on Amazon and look at The Invisible Patient, the emotional, financial, and physical toll on family caregivers, you'll see, and Donna, you created the cover, so you couldn't have nailed it even more than if you tried. You'll see that it's a park bench, and its book cover totally portrays how families are feeling when they come to me. They feel alone, they're isolated, and they're in this journey by themselves, and I'm here to tell you that you are not. So I wrote the book to help families understand that, hey, I'm in your shoes, I've been in your shoes. I help families all across the country who are also in your shoes. And so it's some of my personal journey, but I really wanted to make it kind of like a how-to guide or a manual on, okay, if you have aging parents, this is what you need to know. So there's checklists of, how to facilitate your own family meeting. And I included the agenda. I included checklists. If you want to develop your own grab-and-go binder, if you don't want to buy the one I've created, that's fine, but at least create your own. So I've included, what do you need to have at your fingertips for when you get that crisis call that something's happened. I've created checklists and interview questions on how to tour these care facilities and how to interview home care companies. So I've had all these families through the years say, I wish there was a manual on what to do for mom and dad. And so I created it, and it's called The Invisible Patient.
And it is available for sale on Amazon.com in both paperback and Kindle version.
Thank you. And soon it'll be on Audible as well, thanks to you connecting me with a narrator and editor for Audible. So I understand, that was my only thing about writing the book, is because I too have been a caregiver for my mom before she moved into the memory care facility. And I know how fulfilling it is to be a caregiver, but also how draining it can be, especially when you're trying to work, or, for me, I have 3 businesses. So it's very hard, and it's exhausting trying to do the best you can as that daughter or the son, but knowing you just don't have it in you to be able to really provide what you would have hoped that the memory care facility could do. So it's really not only my personal journey, and you'll also see in the beginning of the book, because my mom died. She choked to death right when we were going through that final editing process. So I also submitted, you'll see in the front of the book, my my letter to my mother the day that she died, or the night that she died, and I got the phone call. So you'll see that it's just a heartfelt book. I too I'm in those shoes. My dad now lives with me in the winter, as I live in Florida, so he lives with me in the winter now, and it's just interesting living with an 84-year-old. so it's, and part of the aging plan consulting that I do with families too is we talk about what are all of the options for care. Hiring professional caregivers, is the family going to do bits and pieces of the caregiving? Like, what do you want to take off your caregiver plate and outsource to someone else? We also talk about, does it make sense to move in together? Families don't realize that your loved one has to financially qualify, they have to cognitively qualify, and they have to physically qualify to get into these care homes. You can't just, because one lives conveniently down the street, or one is built conveniently down the street for you, doesn't mean that your loved one will qualify to get in there. And you can't go into these homes with no money. You have to have a certain amount of money to just be able to even get in the door, let alone stay there. So I educate families about all of the ins and outs, and does it make sense to stay at home, and how much money do you have? What's your caregiver budget for home care? Knowing that that's now, through the pandemic, used to be $21 to $28 an hour nationwide for home care. But again, since the pandemic, everything has gone up. So now I've got clients paying $30 to $40 an hour in home care. That's why it's important to just not only financially figure out what is our plan, what can our parents afford for care, but we also know that seniors don't want to end up being separated. Spouses don't want to be separated from each other through this aging and dying process. They want to be together. And if you don't have an aging plan, you're most likely going to have dad in one facility and mom in another facility, and they may not ever see each other again, especially if healthcare shuts down, if we have another pandemic. So you really need to be thinking about these things, because this is real life. This stuff is going to happen to you, and it's just a matter of when and how prepared you are and how much angst that you want to be in. Whether you do proactive planning, obviously you're going to have better outcomes than if you're in crisis mode. You get whatever you get when you're in crisis mode for care, and it's not going to be what you're hoping for.
Well, Annalee, it's very clear that you have a large wealth and vast amount of experience in the senior caregiving facility. How can someone find out more about you and how you can help?
I'd encourage, if it hits home for you, or you know that in time it's going to hit home for you, or if you are already the burned out caregiver, you're not alone. And so you can go on my website, www.careright.inc, that's CARERIGHT, Inc.com, and you'll see what an aging plan is. You'll see about, just all things aging. There's quite a bit of content on the website, but there's also a bunch of buttons like, I'm ready to schedule my consult, or schedule, you click on those buttons. I have an online calendar, and find a time that works for you for a 30-minute Zoom meeting. And the decision maker needs to be on the call. I'll admit that. So whoever it is that can say yes or no to an aging plan or be helping you needs to be on that call. So you can book it directly. You can book your consult call directly on the website, on the Care Right Inc. website. If you have interest in learning more about the Care Crusade, I started a Care Crusade after my mom passed away. And that whole mission is to improve the quality of healthcare for all patients. I don't care if you're 20 years old or 80 years old, but everyone who enters the healthcare system ought to feel confident that they're going to be properly taken care of by properly trained staff and properly supervised staff and properly managed staff. And that's just not where healthcare is right now. So I am looking for people to join my Care Crusade and task force to put our heads together and say, look, this is the reality of what healthcare is like. We all have a vested interest in improving the quality of care because, well, we're all going to be finding ourselves in the healthcare system in some way, whether it's the ER, the hospital, or potentially senior care. So we all have a vested interest in making sure care is improved.
Annalee, I want to thank you for being our guest today on Business Innovators Radio, and I appreciate all of you listening to today's show. Take care. We'll see you soon in our next episode.
Thanks for listening to Business Innovators Radio. To hear all episodes featuring leading industry influencers and trendsetters, visit us online at businessinnovatorsradio.com today.